hope to begin phase 2 sometime in the fall. And then the last one, but not least, is really one of the major initiatives for us is to rebuild the trust in our community. I think that some of the communication in the past, the fact that information wasn't shared, the fact that results were not what were expected to be, I think has certainly shaken the trust that our community has in us. And that, for me, is actually a major, major goal. And I hope, starting, with even, we started before tonight, but tonight we're going to start building on that trust. And we don't expect instantaneous results. I don't expect people to overnight to say, oh yeah, great, now that's all great, and he's a great guy, and he tells us everything. But I think over time, that part is going to be very important for us. Next slide, please. So the budget, let's take a quick look at the budget. Now, I think some people received copies of that last time when they requested, but if you didn't, you'll have it in the slides. I'm not going to go through every line, but I'm going to pick some highlights. Revenue is important. Revenue last year was $97,864,000. It's unaudited, but I can tell you, and I'll show you why, this number is going to be very close to the actual number. There's not going to be a material difference in revenue this year. And what we budgeted for next year is approximately a 3% increase, which I will show you why that is a reasonable increase for revenue, and it's actually very conservative. The rest of the items is the dish money has been budgeted to be the same as we received last year, which was 9.2 for 6 months for the year. Let's see, state charity care we've kept the same at this time, but we did reduce already the 600, and this is what I was going to get to. Governor Christie announced some cuts in charity care, which were there were half a month of charity care payments for each hospital, so they're proportionate across the board. For us, it's $614,000 between now and June, and that's the cut that we're going to have to make. And this is why when I did my first budget presentation, I said we have excess of revenue over expenses of a few $1 million, but frankly, there are things we don't know are going to happen in this year, and we need to have a little bit of wiggle room and cushion in case something happens. And sure enough, here's the first one, and I'm sure there'll be others before the end of the year. And for some hospitals, that's a much bigger number. Like, for example, Jersey City Medical Center lost $2 million because they get a lot more charity care. But for us, it was $614,000, and everything else we pretty much kept consistent. And as you can see in here, there's the $6 million from the stabilization grant, and the $1 million that we received in December is counted in 09. So the total revenue is $137 million and change. Next slide, please. All right, let me talk to you about revenue, because that's a thing that is not as firm as expenses, and I want to make sure that there's confidence in the revenue number. What I'm showing you here is the budgeted NPSR, which is the net patient service revenue. That means that's the revenue you get from patients, not the charity care money, not the dish money, just the revenue you get from patients. And actual revenue. When you look at 2007, that was probably the first and last year that HUMC did a conservative patient service revenue estimation. The budgeted number was $82.7 million, and the actual number was 94. So we came in higher than the budgeted number. Look what happened the next year. The previous team said we're going to go from 94 to 103. That's almost a $10 million jump. That's a big number. That's 10% of the previous year. And frankly, it didn't materialize, and the revenue came in at 96.4, which is about 3%, approximately. And then in 2009, the budget number was 108.8. Again, a big jump, the budgeted number. And it came in at 97.9. So when you look at the 94, the 96.4, and the 97.9, those are reasonable, without a major initiative where you have a completely new product line, something that you do that's completely different from the year before. That's a reasonable assumption that your revenue is going to go up about 3%. Medicare rates usually have a market increase, a little volume fluctuations. So when you look at 97.9, this year's revenue estimation is a little over 100 million, which is 3%. And that's why I put this up there so you guys know we're not, because what happens with revenue, here's the problem with revenue. If you estimate 108 or 103, this is what happened in 2008. what you do is you end up spending up to that number, unless you correct somewhere midstream and you say something's going on, you know. So if you estimate your revenue to be very high and you keep posting it as, and calculating as being very high and it doesn't materialize, then you end up spending up to the number. So you definitely don't want to have a revenue number you're not going to achieve. Next slide, please. All right, expense side. We talked about this already. Here's the one thing I want to point out, because I'm sure there are going to be some questions about that. We talked about $11 million in savings, right? And when you look at expenses, you'll see that there is $5 million in change difference. Whoa, where did the $6 million go? Well, here's what happens, and it was too busy to put this up here, but we saved $11 million, but I told you we're going to have major initiatives next year. So the hospitalist program, for example, is going to cost about $1 million. We probably need to hire a chief medical officer, and that salary is in there. The vascular lab folks have a salary, so if you open a vascular lab, at least for the quarter that you're going to have it, you're going to have to pay those salaries. There are increases in utilities, which we know are going to happen based on experience. There's increases in supplies. If you look at supplies, we estimated a 2.6% increase for inflation. So what happens is we backed out 11, but you have to back in about 6 of those in those initiatives and the cost of living. I mean the inflation factors for those utilities and supplies and so on. And then when you look at salaries, just to clarify that part too, 5.7 is in actual salaries. There's 3.4 in benefits. I'm sorry, thanks for finding the right word for me. Because I said that the 401k falls in there, and also some of the union benefit reductions. And then what's in there, and actually I forgot to mention when I talked about the concessions, one of the things that we did, and that was the catalyst to get the union concessions, is the thing that the unions really were upset the most about, and I can surely understand it, is that we had just negotiated a contract with the nurses in September. And the union said, wait a second, you just negotiated a contract in September. Now you want to take back 10% and you're not going to even honor the contract? We would have gotten nowhere in negotiations if we started off from the standpoint of we're not going to honor your contract. So what we said to them, forget about that. Let's take this off the table. We will honor your contract. What that contract says is that in July of 2010, they're going to get a 1.75% increase in their salaries, which for the year is 0.8725, whatever it is. So it's less than 1%. And so we've added that back into the budget. And we said, take this off the table. We're not going to go back on the contract, but we want 10% now. And so that's why, you'll see if you add the percentages, they're slightly less than 10, because there is some back add-on into the salary for that increase. Next slide, please. All right, so the whole thing, now the third piece is sort of how you come together. From operations, right now we're projecting with no other change, which we know there are going to be some changes, $4.3 million in revenue over expenses. However, we said and we committed that we're also going to make sure we cover the debt service out of that. Debt service is that's interest, $2.6 million. So if you take that debt service out of the 4.4 almost, you end up with a little less than $2 million in cash, theoretically. Of course, with nothing else happening. Depreciation, we said we can't fund this year, but our goal was to fund all the operations and the interest. And then we have the sale of the rehab beds, which we talked about, which actually the closing is next week, you said, Andy, right? Tuesday, which brings in $1.2 million. What bond counsel has told us is that $1.2 million needs to go towards defeasing the bond. It needs to go towards capital expenditure. So that's money we can't draw into operations and pay salaries and so on, but it's money we can draw on, to refurbish elevators and things we talked about that are absolutely necessary next year. Next slide, please. All right. Lots of talk, but how do we do in January? Well, the financials are coming out this Friday, but I got a preview. I get this sometimes as a CEO. Sometimes I get to see something before everybody else. They're not done, but these numbers are going to hold, because we gathered all our expenses and know what the revenue was. The financials right now for January show a $300,000 income before interest and depreciation. If you take interest out of it, interest is about $200,000 a month. So it still shows an income. Now, what's important is this. Yes, there's $1 million of stabilization in there. I know somebody's going to ask the question. But the concessions that we did, you know, the union voted on the concessions, I think it was January 5th and then January 9th, 2 unions. And they were effective with pay period number 3 for the unions, still for 1 year, but starting pay period number 3. And this pay period fell in February. So in January, we only have 1/3 of the labor concessions, which is just for the non-union employees. The savings from the union employees are not in there yet.